Okay, so I think we are live now. I will still wait until whatever the time is. For me, it will be midday on the dot. I'll wait before actually starting, just in case more people will join, but at least it's all working fine. 2 minutes, 1 minute now. But it's great to see so many people here. This is, yeah, exciting. Oh, and Alex, yes, just to mention as well, we are, you said that it was fine to record, so we are recording as well, if that's okay, and then this will be available after. So for anybody who's, I don't know, listening, we plan on uploading this to our YouTube channel, and we'll send a link out afterwards when everything's uploaded. Clearly, there are a lot of people interested in foraging, which is great. Nice to see that it's a topic that so many people are interested in. So I think maybe we should get started because it is now, or maybe I should turn my notifications off. That would probably be a good idea. Okay. So, okay, I think, yes, let's begin. So firstly, thank you everyone for joining us for our first episode of the Future of Foraging seminar series, which I think is a very dramatic title, but I like it. So we're really, of course, really excited for the lineup of speakers that we have for this first season. And we hope that we're going to be able to start bringing together neuroscientists, ecologists, ethologists, computational modelers, and so on. Anybody who's really interested in this cool class of behavior foraging. So I'm Laura, I'm a postdoc in the Dublin lab at Geneva, and the other co-organizers on the screen will introduce ourselves a bit later during the discussion. But to kick off this series, we wanted to start by actually defining the behavior that we're all sort of talking about and interested in. And we wanted to invite somebody who could provide us with some historical perspective in the field, but who is also still really working on the cutting edge of behavioral ecology. So I'm really excited to introduce Professor Alex Kacelnik, FRS. Alex is an emeritus professor of behavioral ecology at the University of Oxford. He established his behavioral ecology group in Oxford in 1990. And since then, and also even before then, he's had a really, really cool, like wonderfully diverse career. So in terms of both of his experimental work and the organisms that he studied. So he's studied tool use in New Caledonian crows, decision-making in starlings, and also some more recently, some really cool work in information seeking in rats. And of course, you know, many other organisms and types of behavior as well. But the theoretical approach that's really tied together much of his work is an emphasis on understanding decision-making. And he's done this through adopting lots of different perspectives, including economic and evolutionary theories. But of particular relevance to this series, ecological theory and modeling, in particular optimal foraging, which he will talk about today. So we're really, really honored to have you with us today, Alex. Thank you so much for your time. And I think we should begin.
Okay, then I'm going to share my screen, if I can. Yes. Okay, can someone give me feedback on whether you're seeing my screen all right?
That looks perfect. Thanks, Alex.
Good. Okay. Well, it's of course it's great and it's intimidating to talk about optimal foraging in general, making a history of it. And one is always tempted to talk about the most recent and most troublesome research, but because of Laura's invitation, I'm going to focus on very old stuff at the beginning, because I believe that some of rather fundamental debates on foraging have been almost forgotten for a long time. So I think that if we think about optimal foraging theory, we have to be aware that in the past, and probably in the present, although this is not being discussed much, optimal foraging have been a very controversial approach. And some of the old debates are not really resolved, and we should not forget them. We should keep thinking about the problems which are not resolved, lest we repeat our mistakes, right? And the first thing I want to do is to define what I think of optimal foraging theory, because it's important. It will color everything I say. I think of optimal foraging theory not as a theory in the sense of making a statement that could be true or false, but as a research program that is characterized by trying to describe, explain, and predict behavior, particularly resource-oriented behavior, using optimality techniques. So this is not a definition that everybody would use, but it's the one I will use. So to avoid semantic debates, this is what I will mean when I talk about OFT. And it's very important that we are aware that research programs are not true or false, like you could say string theory or something like that. They can be progressive or they can be degenerate, depending on the way they relate to science. This is one particular view in the philosophy of science, is the one that Lakatos defends, and I feel that it does represent the way I think about it. So I'm going to accept that, and I will explain a little bit of what that means. So the question I will want to ask and answer or debate is whether optimal foraging is a progressive or a degenerate research program. Basically, whether it's a good thing or a bad thing. And I'm going to use two chapters from a book which I have over here, which you're not seeing my screen, of course. Are you seeing myself? Everybody? No. Okay.
Yes, we can see you, Alex. Yeah, we can.
Okay, fine, because I don't have an image. So I'm going to be using two chapters published in a 1987 book by Camille Krebs and Pulliam that reflected a conference 3 years before, in 1984, in Providence, in Brown University, in Rhode Island. And one article, one chapter, was called Faith and Foraging, a critique of the paradigm argument from design by Russell Gray. I think this was an extraordinary contribution and remains very good reading, and it was very important. Russell was then just a young postdoc, just out of his PhD, and I think he made a great contribution by attacking the view that everybody was accepting at that meeting in a more or less uncritical way. And another chapter in the same book is by myself with Ines Cahill, which was my first PhD, one of my first PhD students. And we wrote a defense of the approach under the title Starlings and Optimal Foraging Theory, Modeling in a Fractal World. So I'm going to first give a few words of what Russell said, and then I'm going to go in detail on what Ines and I replied or the way we looked at it. So first, what Russell Gray said about it. By the way, I invited Russell. I don't know if he came to this meeting, but it would be nice if he's around, if he could participate in the debate at the end. This is some quotes. I know that quotes can be taken out of context, but I hope I took quotes from his work that really reflect the spirit of what he was trying to say. He's reviewed 487 articles published up to that time, mostly on diet choice, and these are some of his quotes. One thing he said is, only the weakest prediction of OFT have been confirmed. Its basic concepts are vague, and the most problematic part of the theory is impossible to test. He was referring to the functionality and optimality of behavior. He further said, it is frequently claimed that the optimal foraging methodology provides insight. Researchers who adopt this position stress the value of optimal foraging models as tools for thought, rather than as generators of quantitative predictions. This defense avoids the rather embarrassing problem that OFT lacks strong empirical support. He further said that on the basis of the analysis that he provides in his chapter, what today we would call a meta-analysis, it wasn't then called that way, he says, I have already demonstrated that OFT's precision is more apparent than real. Actually, it's false precision. And he further said, the problem with OFT is not just that it has not come up with many novel insights, but more seriously, that it has restricted our conceptions of foraging behavior in certain harmful ways. So it's not just neutral and wrong, it's actually bad for us. He did this with brilliance and with humor. For example, he had this cartoon of the marginal value theorem, which will be familiar to this graph, to 90% of the audience at least. It predicts something, we'll come back to that, the optimal time in a patch that an animal should stay when it's foraging. But of course, he said this never happens. And when it doesn't happen, what people do is what Ptolemaic astronomers were doing to explain the misbehavior of planets in the sky. They either say that, oh, well, it would have done it, but there were too many predators, or what does it say? The prey had some level of toxicity, or there was an incorrect time scale, or the animals committed discrimination mistakes, or there were sampling the environment, etc. So that this point becomes a complete foggy area and untestable idea, all illuminated by the sun of optimality just flashing onto it. I think it's, as I say, I think it was brilliant to do it this way, and it was very inspiring, and we should still be thinking about this problem. What was his alternative if OFT was wrong? Well, that was a shorter part of the chapter, and it said the alternative approach to foraging behavior I outlined attempts to resolve the problems of OFT by rejecting functional explanations. That's a very robust statement. And by reformulating the organism-environment relations in terms of reciprocally constrained construction, which is something that sounds really nice and dynamic and dialectical, I would say. The problem is how to make it pragmatically real, how to use it to guide real research. And that's something I can't answer because I don't know how you do that. And at the end of his chapter, his conclusion was, it is in this way that evolutionary biologists may finally break loose from the idea of optimal design, a tradition that could be said to wait like a nightmare on the brain of the living. He was saying that basically the reason we were all working with optimality is that we were, as it were, infected by the history of natural theologians, people who used the idea of design by some deity that was actually responsible for the perfect adaptation of organisms. And of course, nobody would want to be in that company. So let me restart by saying, how do scientific research programs work, right? A very general statement. I think the way you normally work is by identifying interesting problems, and there is no recipe for this. You just have to think about it, and who knows what leads us to discover what is an interesting problem to work on. When you discover that, you start thinking theoretically about it, you formulate hypotheses about it, and you use these hypotheses to design precise models and to make further predictions. Once you've done that, you use the models to do the experiments that are appropriate and to test the predictions that you have just formulated. When you get the results, you correct your models, you check your hypotheses, and you reformulate new predictions. And you go back and you hope that in the process of doing all of this, you have generated knowledge and you have identified new problems that are worth your continuing research forever and ever. In the course of this, I'm going to repeat a commonplace. Everybody's aware of George Box's statement, never more true than at the present, saying that all models are wrong by just being models, but some of them are useful. The question is optimal foraging overall constituted by useful models? And here is when I want to define what guides my preoccupation. I think we have to decide whether particular programs are in a cycle, in a loop of the kind that you see in that slide, but in the course of doing that, they generate knowledge. Bit by bit, in every step, you generate new knowledge, and the knowledge leads you to attack new problems, right? And so that you keep attacking reality forward and being more and more detailed in the way you look at the world, thanks to the fact that you are using a particular framework. The alternative, which is what happened to the Ptolemaic view of the solar system with the Earth at the center, is that you have a degenerate program in the sense that continuously it keeps failing, and you keep inventing. That should be excuses. It's a typo. You keep inventing excuses for the reason that your model failed. It's never ending. It's more and more complicated, and you invent epicycles, as in the cartoon of the marginal value theorem that I showed earlier. So the question is, can we use real examples from research to decide whether OFT belongs to one or the other kinds of program? Does it work or doesn't it work? And let's start to go into greater detail. In the chapter that Ines Kacelnik and myself wrote in the same book, we divided optimality models into three hypotheses. And it's very important that we call it hypotheses, right? And we said one of them is about what is being maximized. What is the maximum of the data we are going to collect, right? Or to produce in the model. But here there is a problem. We could be talking about what behavior maximizes in general, and then we are talking about fitness and about natural selection. But then we could also be talking what is driving the animal if the animal has goal-seeking behavior? What is its utility? And these two things might or might not coincide. In many cases, if you think that they are the same, you would get it wrong. I don't have time to go into that, but the basic thing is you may be eating to calm your hunger, but you are hungry because that keeps you alive or leads to greater reproduction. So the two things are very different. One is a mechanism to ensure the other. Now, then you have to make a hypothesis about the strategy set. And here what you are asking is, what are the possible actions my organism can do? And this can be constrained because some organisms can do certain things, others cannot. And they can, in this phrase, is something debatable. What if I can't do it because of a psychological constraint? For example, I would like to lend you money, but I can't because I'm selfish. So that would be one way to say that my strategy set doesn't include to be generous to you. So there are many complications in doing this. And finally, you have to postulate a feedback function. The feedback function responds to the same problems that we had at the beginning with the currency. So you have to ask, what would be the fitness consequences of each action, but in the wild, not in the laboratory, because fitness can only be measured in real populations, and of course, in the past, in the environment of evolutionary adaptedness. So you may be measuring some consequence here, but in the laboratory, but that doesn't mean that that reflects the real fitness consequences of that behavior in general where the animal lives. But in the laboratory, you can work on the second of the currencies that we discussed. That is, what are the consequences of the behavior of the animal in terms of the utility outcomes that the animal experiences? And that leads to a different kind of models and also a more testable kind of models in the laboratory circumstances. We'll go through this in some detail as we go along. And what are the predictions? You have three hypotheses. Well, you combine this and you ask, what are the actions within the strategy set that maximize the currency given the feedback function. So all that gives you a prediction. And what you do if you fail or don't fail? Well, one of your hypotheses must be wrong when your model, when your predictions don't fit the data. And this is what we are going to work on. But of course, you can immediately see that formulating those three hypotheses is not trivial. In many cases, there are logical circularities, and the hypothesis should be testable and can help you, but it's not a clear-cut problem. In that sense, I am joining the critique of a naive view of optimal foraging that doesn't take into account these philosophical difficulties from the beginning. Now, let me remind you of the marginal value theorem, although I'm sure that all of you have seen it in your textbooks before, but just in case. The basic representation, I'm going to use exclusively graphic models today, but all of these are just graphical presentations of mathematical analysis, okay? And let's say that you have a situation when an animal forages in a patch of food and it accumulates gain, and the amount of gain it accumulates is negatively accelerated. So that as you spend longer time for one reason or another, you start collecting benefit at a lower rate. And you could stay a certain time, indicated by this little circle. What would happen if you do that? Every visit you go and you stay for that long. Well, you can see that if you trace that line, the slope of that line is obviously, if you see my cursor, the height over the ordinate, and the ratio of that is the slope of this line, and that's exactly the gain over the patch time, okay? So what happens if you stay, for example, less time than that? Well, what you see is that if you stay very little time, if you trace the same line, this will be steeper than that. So the shorter the time you stay, the higher is the gain over patch time. So you should stay an infinitely short time. So that can't work. Something is missing. Well, what is missing here is that we haven't analyzed that there is a cost in changing from one patch to another. When you take into account the travel time between patches, you trace a new line like this, and now the slope of this line is the gain as before, but then the abscissa, is the time in the patch plus the time traveling. And this slope of this line, we can represent as the gain over the sum of time in the patch plus the travel time, okay? This is what we talk about when you talk about the rate. Now you can see that if you stay for a shorter time, this would be less steep than that. So your rate of gain would be lower for a short time than for a longer time. But what is the absolute best you can do? Well, you can see which is the potential time in the patch that maximizes the steepness of this line. And that, of course, is the one which is tangent to the curve. At this point, this is the optimal time in the patch. You're maximizing your rate of gain. Okay, that's a basic that I'm sure you are all familiar with. It's important to know that the MVT identifies the patch time that maximizes the rate of gain, given the hypothesis about, for example, the shape of that blue curve, right? That's the optimal patch time. Now, what happens if in one occasion the patches are very close and in another they are very far? You have a short or a long travel time. Well, you can see that the optimum for a long travel time is different from the optimum for a short one. And that basically leads to the prediction that for longer travel between patches, the longer should be the time that you stay in each patch, okay? So this is the basic prediction, and the MVT should be understood as being a model of how an animal can switch between activities in general. The same reasoning can apply to how much you grow your liver as opposed to growing your kidney, for example. So for any switch, when you take into account costs of transition and diminishing returns, you can use this theoretical construct to make predictions as to what is the optimal behavior. It's also important that we remember that the MVT is a theorem, and theorems are not under empirical test. You don't go around measuring triangles to see whether Pythagoras' theorem is right. You know that Pythagoras' theorem is true because it's a theorem, right? What you don't know is whether it's a useful one, whether it relates to real biological problems. That's where experiments come into the picture. That's what I'm going to go into right now. So in 1981, I went to do a postdoc in Groningen University in the Netherlands. And that's where I met Joost Timbergen. I was going to be an extraordinarily influential collaborator of mine for the next few years and remained a friend until today. And Joost had just finished his thesis, and one of the findings in his thesis, inspired by the MVT, he measured in starlings that were feeding their young and flying back and forth from their nests, what was the loads that they brought back when they went further away, this is a long travel time, or to a nearby patch. And he found that there was a correlation. So time in the patch and load is the same. I'm going to use them interchangeably. Correlate with round trip travel time. This is the travel that the animal had to do back and forth. So this appears to be supportive of the MVT. When we discussed this the very first day, and I still have memory of seeing this data, first thought, great, this is the first test of the marginal value theorem in the field. But then I asked, well, if starlings really are following the logic of the marginal value theorem and they're maximizing the rate of delivery of food to the nest, why do they sometimes go far and sometimes go near? It doesn't make any sense. They should always go near, right? Unless the distant patches happen to be better than the near ones. That's the only reason to go further. But if they are better when they are far, then the MVT doesn't apply anymore. So the basic conclusion that you could reach is that natural variance in travel time, as shown here, cannot be used to test the specific predictions of the marginal value theorem. What you need is to create identical patches, but at different distances, and then you can test that prediction. And now I'm going to take about 3.5 minutes of the talk to show you an experiment I designed and did to test exactly this problem. That's me close to 40 years ago, and this is me training a starling in the field to actually come and collect worms that I was dropping from that tube. And in this case, the patch is very close to the nest, and the worms are falling with increasing intervals between them, so that it was exactly mimicking or constructing the load curve, the decelerated load curve that we talked about in the marginal value theorem model. And I worked a lot through the winter before the spring came and we were to go to this island to do the work, trying to see what shape of curve would best allow me to discriminate between predictions of the marginal value theorem at the range of distances that starlings normally forage with respect to the nest. So you can see the starling picking up worms. You can't see the worms, but every so often the animal picks one. It seems to be hesitant about whether to depart or not, but at one point it collects a worm and then it finally leaves immediately after a particular, let's call it capture, collecting one. It's looking inside the tube because it knows that's where they come from, right? So it collects one and goes back and gives this to the young. So this is the situation. The young are being fed, and notice that they do an effort, a metabolic effort in becoming active as opposed to resting quietly whenever they get fed. So that was something that also called my attention when I started to look at that. This is another visit just to show you. And this paper was published 3 years before the conference we are talking about, the book we're talking about. The experimental work was done in 82 and the paper published in 84 in Journal of Animal Ecology. it produced a very quantitative test of the predictions of the marginal value theorem. It's important that we see the next bit of the film. So going on. Now, what I did is displacing the patch very visibly to a place that was 800 meters away from the nest, as opposed to being just 10 or so meters at the beginning. I was counting my steps, and
Yeah, sorry about this, everyone. I think I will. I've just re-invited Alex, but I'm not sure if he's having internet problems. Maybe I will keep sort of trying to invite him and try and get him back online. But sorry about this. This is the problem with technology. This is the downside to things not being in person.
oh,
here we go. Lovely. There we go. Yes, exactly. Hannah is correct. We've had some time to think about the
I
interesting things
didn't
you're talking
even
about,
notice.
Alex.
How
Sorry
long
about
ago
that. Yeah.
did you lose contact? Was just now? Or was it in the middle of the film?
Probably it was sort of like
Okay.
about 30 seconds
Okay.
ago. Maybe I would say. So
Yes.
it happens.
So let me go back. I have to restart this. Okay.
I do wonder
Yes,
whether
I'm
the
going
film
to skip
might
the end of the film.
exactly. You were
and go to
moving.
the next slide directly. Maybe the film was too much for the system. But the basic thing is that now, are you there, Laura? Is that okay? Is it working?
Yeah,
Okay.
everything's working fine, Alex.
Okay.
Thank you.
Now this is the data. So this is the way we calculate the rate. So the number of worms, that's the load taken by the animal, we call it the gain, over the sum of travel time plus patch time. The lines here are the predictions of the model at different distances, and the load that the animal took is represented in the points. Of course, the predictions are stepwise, and because it's integers of worms, and the data are averages, so you can have intermediate points. And well, you look at it and it's pretty good, but on the other hand, it's clear that there are more points above the predictions than below the predictions. So the predictions and the data are significantly different from each other. So we start thinking, why does it fail to that extent? And we think, well, there are things this is not doing. For example, computing the energy expenditure of traveling and the energy expenditure of the chicks when they are collecting the food. So if you put that in the model and you say, I'm going to see what happens if I maximize the gain minus the expenditure of the whole family, parents and young, over the same amount of time. And what you see is that the predictions have changed. The data are the same, of course, but now there are more points below the line than there were before. And now the model and the data are not significantly different anymore. We cannot reject the null hypothesis that the model describes precisely the data. But what we can do is ask the question, is this the only kind of currency that the animal could be maximizing, and clearly it's not. For example, it makes total sense to think of an animal that maximizes gain over cost instead of gain over time, right? And so this ratio produces a completely different model that is shown here. Again, the same data, but now this model shows predictions which are much higher than the data themselves. Now, what do you conclude? You could conclude that the animal, well, some people might conclude that the animal doesn't know optimality or is wrong or something like that. But the most logical conclusion is that your model was wrong. One of the hypotheses was wrong because various defensible currencies, logical ones, yield different levels of fit. And we cannot just defend one currency over another simply because it has a better fit. Otherwise, we would be like economists. We really have to actually think of what is the logic, the biological logic of why the animal is doing one thing or another. I'm not going to go into that into much detail because I want to deal with other problems. Let's say that we are quite happy that this version of the model works quite well. What do you do next? Well, if you love your model, you challenge it. And then you start thinking of what kind of challenge you could pose that would make life difficult for your model. And one of them is to change the gain function. Suppose that the gain function has the same basic property, but now is constituted by a couple of straight lines. So what happens to the marginal value theorem? For a long travel, this is the optimum. For a short travel, that is the optimum. Exactly the same load, but for different travel times. So all you've done is to change the gain function, and what you find is that the prediction of a correlation with travel doesn't apply anymore. If the patch is poorer, rather than instead of a rich patch is a poor one, meaning that this slope is shallower, then you find that the amount of food that the animal should bring is exactly the same as in a rich patch. But of course, it will take it longer because it takes longer to reach that amount of food, okay? So basically, now the optimal load should be insensitive. We should lose the correlation altogether. That's a good challenge to the model. And we expect it to be a flat optimal load, a flat load as a function of travel distance. What does it happen? Well, this is work now done in Oxford with Ines Cattell, and what we find is that as travel change, the load brought by the animals, both in the rich patch and in the poor patch, increase with travel, right? And of course, in a poor patch, it took longer, so you see these differences here. But this means that the load brought by the animals correlates with travel when it should not. And we have to say, well, our model has a problem, and which of the hypotheses is wrong? We reason about a number of possible things, but we focus, or today I'm going to focus on one possibility. We split the return travel now, and we thought, well, the animal has one travel from the nest to the patch, and another back from the patch to the nest, a return trip. And what if loading a greater, carrying a bigger load slows down the flight of the animal? So what you will have is, for example, for a very small load, the travel time back home is the same as the travel time out from the nest to the patch. But as you carry bigger loads, it takes you longer. This, of course, is an exaggerated response, but let's say that you have this kind of response. In that case, what matters is the line between here at the end of the whole cycle, which is this blue dotted line here. And now you've restored the prediction of the MVT because the travel back to the nest is affected by the load you carry. So this was a theoretical prediction, or not prediction, sorry, a reasoning hypothesis that could account post hoc for the data that we had observed, right? So we asked the empirical question now of whether it was the case that the travel time increases as you carry a bigger load. And we measured that. So here we controlled the load by setting the system at different distances and delivering to the animal a fixed load and no more. So this is the travel time going back to the nest, and this is the load. The data are these are units of standard deviation to normalize data across different distances. And what you find is exactly what the model required, an accelerated increase in travel time as a function of the load being carried. So here we find that the experiment was done only because we thought about what would save the model or what would save the general reasoning. And we generated novel information. Now it opens a field of research into why why flying can be affected by carrying a load. So all these things accumulate to the kind of questions that we refine and ask again. Now we have another problem. The MVT, you may or may not have thought about that, but is completely insensitive to whether the travel time is fixed or variable. The predictions are for either an environment with a short travel or an environment with a large travel. But if in one environment there is a lot of variance, short and long travels are intermingled, because the animal is maximizing, taking into account the future travel and not the last one, only the average matters, not what you did last, right? It's not a prediction about the previous travel time. So variance should have no effect. The last travel time, if you have, for example, long, short, let's say in a random sequence, then variance should not affect, or the difference in length should not affect what you bring. Another challenge to the model. So this we couldn't do in the field because of the nature of the question. So we did it in the lab. We created a situation where the animal could fly back and forth between two perches, mimicking travel time, and then at some point it was allowed to go into a patch, and then it could work by collecting prey from going back and forth between the perch and the patch with an increasing interval, just as we did in the field, and we measured whether the animal, as we predicted, would stay the same amount of time or collect the same load after short travels and long travels. What did they do? They did not. After long travels, these are different animals, and white is after a long travel, short is after a short travel. All the animals stayed significantly long after longer travels than short travels. So once again, we refuted our model by posing it a different challenge. So we have to think, well, is this an accident of our experiment, or is a property of our animal? Would other species do the same? And now I switch to making a test in a completely different physical setup. This was with another collaborator, a postdoc called Ian Todd, in which we set the same problem to pigeons. And these pigeons had two keys. In one of them, they could travel for a certain time, and in the other, represented arrival at a patch. And as they started to work on this patch, so to speak, they started to accumulate food, and they could carry on, but of course the intervals became larger and larger, exactly as in the situations before. And now we could manipulate as we wanted the variance between different travels in the environment. And what we did, we had in this case 3 treatments which had either 1 travel in the mixture, or 10 travels in the mixture, or only 2 travels in the mixture. And that, of course, varied the coefficient of variation of travel times. What we found is that whenever, I think this should come here, yes. Whenever the variance was 0, that's always the same travel, the animals more or less took what was expected, but as the variance increased, they took lesser and lesser travels. So look at the bars, the black bars. I'm not going to go into the further details here because of time. And what that means is that the pigeon's estimates of travel time seem to shrink as variance increases. And this was the same kind of results as we got with starlings. But the finding here of a violation of the prediction of our optimality model was that the variance in travel time affects the perception of time intervals. When we got connected to this problem, I started working with people with an interest in the perception of time. And from that followed 20 years of collaboration, mostly with John Gibbon, my late colleague John Gibbon, and with Danny Brunner, with Melissa Bateson, and with a number of other people on which we worked on the relation between problems of perception of time durations, averaging processes, and schemes like the marginal value and other problems that I haven't got time to explain. But what I want to summarize here is that there is a constant dynamics of relation between the model, the expectations, and the data that we are collecting. So similar talks can be given on this kind of problems in completely different fields. All these different areas in the last 30, 40 years have guided our research by surprising us with results that were not what we expected. And that led to further iterations of the cycle of theory, prediction, data collection, and accumulation of data about the behavior of organisms. Now, I want to finish by a very brief description of one experiment, the last one we published in areas related to this. This relates to a topic that many of you will also be familiar, the problem of impulsivity. You could read in the literature statements like these ones. This one, for example, comes from evolutionary biologists. Animals are said that, well, or let me read it. When provided with a choice between a small short delay, that is a small reward with a short delay, and a large reward with a long delay, there is an impulsive preference for the former. Additionally, as the delay time for both rewards increases, there is a shift in preference towards the larger one, to the more delayed one. This evidence only supports hyperbolic discounting, not exponential discounting. I'm sure many of you are familiar with this, but it doesn't matter if you haven't come across. This is important even in therapy in humans. For example, in this paper on attention deficit disorder, you read individuals with attention deficit disorder preferentially choose smaller sooner over larger later rewards. And this is termed impulsive choice. Well, let's look at this with the perspective of the MVT. If the observed preference is defined as impulsive, what would be the preference that animals should show? More or less? Presumably, less preference, because preferring the larger later is considered to be wrong, impulsive. And the discounting analysis take every choice in isolation. All these analyses do that. While in fact in foraging theory in general, you consider sequences of choices over time as a string. You accumulate the results. Now, some economists working on ergodicity economics are starting to consider that overall. What happens if you do that? Well, let me describe just one experiment. This is a recent publication with Tiago Monteiro and Marco Vasconcelos, two current colleagues, let's say. What we did is we had starlings that had a mixture of 6 rewards plotted in the same axis as we are used to. This is delay, equivalent to the patch time, and this is amount of food. And there were 6 combinations. They would come in a random sequence, and they were organized so that there were pairs of large later and small soon with exactly the same ratio of amount over time, which is called profitability, the same profitability. This is a definition from optimal foraging theory, this term. So an impulsive animal in this context would prefer the large late over the small soon, right? In all these 3 pairs. What do the animals do? What the animals did in this case, in all cases, would prefer the larger one rather than the smaller one. When profitability is controlled, the animals were not impulsive, but if anything, the opposite. They basically did something that we have to explain from the optimality perspective, which is why not being indifferent between these two pairs, but rather preferring always the large one of them. Well, we go back to the MVT. This is when the pairs are organized so that they are equal, right? But if you take into account the interval between trials and you trace the slope line as we did before, what you find is that in all cases, the large one has a steeper slope than the smaller one in all these pairs, right? Simply because you are adding the intertrial interval. So if the animal pays attention to the variables that we consider, they should prefer the large one as they do. This is now the amount of food over the delay plus the intertrial interval. I'm going to skip the next two or three slides because let me just skip this. Now, why was this relevant to our story? Because the optimal foraging perspective originated in the first place the notion of paying attention to profitability and to rate of reward. And this helped in a completely different field, the field of impulsivity, and even in human psychological responses to different delayed rewards. The predictions of optimal foraging models very often fail, but the failures are interesting to us because they violate functional expectations. If we didn't have the functional expectation, nothing would be violated, and we wouldn't be surprised. So for this reason, I don't think we should abandon functional thinking, and it was proposed. Just as animal learning, as you know, people who know the Rescorla-Wagner model and others, just as animal learning is driven by surprise, by unexpected result, scientific research benefits from a functional framework in which model failures do surprise us. We are not indifferent to different kinds of results. We have a clear rational prediction that has strong rationale, and in the course of failing this, we learn things about the animals, we produce new knowledge, and we inspire further questions. So this has been done in many themes, but I want to conclude by asking, should we now jump to the brain and see what the brain is doing? Well, you can if you wish. My problem is that very often when people link foraging theory to the brain, they trivialize the foraging problem. They don't see that the predictions of classical optimal foraging never actually were static. They were always affected. The criticism raised from the beginning were true, and foraging should be studied seriously. And I hope I have helped a little bit for you to listen to further talks and always have present, are these people using models as they should? Are they challenging their models, making them fail in detail, and then going on to produce new models and challenge the new models and generating new information in a cycle, in a persistence cycle? So my conclusion is foraging models are fine, but they are serious stuff. You have to use them carefully. This is the conclusion that Ines, Kathiel, and I reached, and this is really my final slide. Sorry, I'm being a bit long. I'm going to read it for you. We wrote then, and I support now, the following. It says, biological reality recedes in front of our attempts to explain it with the fractal appearance of one of the white flakes resulting from salting a solution of soap. As we succeed in explaining a problem at a certain local level, we discover our ignorance at another level. OFT appears to us as the best available tool to progress along this road of greater understanding. While we must be aware of the theory's weaknesses, none of the discrepancies between specific OFT models and data found so far leads us to conclude that it is a regressive, we would say degenerate, misleading research program, or that evolutionary arguments as embodied in OFT hinder, are harmful, rather than enhance scientific progress in the field. And with this, I finish. I ought to thank many, many people. I can't really do, but those are some of the names that have collaborated in my thinking over the years. Shall I get out of this?
Yeah, that was lovely. Thank you. I'm just re-inviting back the other co-organizers, but also if anybody has questions, we're starting to get some questions coming in.
Now, should I stop sharing?
So, yeah, that's a good idea. Yeah, that would be great.
I
Thanks.
can't find it. Oh, here, possibly. Yes.
Yes, I think it should be in the top right.
Maybe.
Or I think maybe I can. Maybe I can do
yes.
this. Yeah.
Okay.
Let me see. There we go.
Great. Thank you.
Okay. Yes, we have 2 questions already, actually. One question from Shiba is, when you introduce animals to novel foraging environments, it might take a while before they settle on a strategy or learn the one that maximizes their gain. And so do you see evidence of this, for example, in your tent experiments?
Yes, absolutely. Animals have to learn, for example, if you have, there's so many examples. If you have a mixture of travel times or a mixture of patch types, how does the animal know what the mixture is before experiencing that for a while? So you put an animal in a given environment and you see them adjusting their response to what they are experiencing. And if you follow their behavior in detail, for example, if you look by inserting pig trials exactly when the animal expects food, you find that if you have a progressive gain function, the animal expects food at progressive intervals, and it reveals in its working behavior that it knows exactly the nature of its gain function, but that comes from learning.
Great, thank you. And so I'm just going through questions in order of how many upvotes they get. Josh Dubin says, wonderful talk. There is one key concept that you did not offer a definition for, a patch. And he says, I am interested in whether you think patches can be well defined or whether you have done experiments to validate such a definition.
Yeah, no, I don't think that a patch is an automatically clear. I think it should be thought of carefully. In our case, of course, in the experiments, we created a patch, which is an area within which there is no variance in the property of the gain function. So if you have such an area, that's fine. But for example, when you look at starlings, real starlings foraging in the field, this will be true for other animals, but I'll tell you for starlings, what you see is that they don't revisit the same place. So they go poking in the ground the way starlings do, you may have seen them, and they always are exploring virgin territory as they move around. And as a consequence, they are not depleting the place. They are always experiencing new one. But what you see is that if they are foraging for babies, then they're accumulating prey in their beak. And as a consequence, it's less efficient foraging as they charge more. So load becomes a very important factor rather than patch exploitation. So yes, you have to think about that as well. If the animal is foraging for self, then the function is linear, right? As we described before, because it encounters prey always in virgin territory. And we do know that animals change their way of locomotion, the way of displacement, as a function of the richness they experience. If there is greater richness, they would shift their behavior so as to stay longer in a given area to benefit from the local high density. But we published a paper with a colleague, Carlos Bernstein, in which the paper was patch models gain a lease of life. It was in Trends in Ecology and Evolution. And we explained the problem of having a continuous environment and the definition of a patch when animals face that kind of situation.
Excellent. Yeah, thank you. So we have another question from D. Barrack, who says, foraging is fundamental to all mobile organisms. Foraging models are increasingly applied to internal cognitive internal cognitive search. What are your thoughts on these applications? And this is quite an interesting one.
As I said before, some of the foraging models are not specifically foraging. As I said, the marginal value theorem, you can change the label of the axis and the prediction will be exactly the same. I mean, in fact, it originates in economics from the 1920s that people started to pay attention. If you think as an economist which is deciding on investment, and if you have diminishing return by investing more capital or recruiting more workers in a particular enterprise, and you have diminishing returns, at some point you say, oh, I'm going to keep this that size, I'm going to invest my money on something else. And then I have to pay a cost on setting things up, buying a new building, buying something. So that's your travel time, the cost of a transition. And then that's a gain function, the same one. So that had been developed in economics. The question is, and it's a theorem, as a theorem is absolutely correct as a logical construct. The question is, does it apply, does it help you pragmatically to investigate reality? I would say to attack reality from an epistemological perspective. Does it guide the way you interact with the world by asking new questions, better questions, and in the process of doing that, accumulating reliable knowledge about your species? So does it happen in brain research? Sorry, to go back to the question. Does it happen in cognitive research? Well, sometimes it does, but sometimes the predictions are taken a little bit mechanically, and people generate a game in the computer that say, oh, this represents the marginal value theorem in the computer because I have to change patch and then I start playing this. But when we get we are not trying to corroborate our predictions. We are trying to test whether the framework is logical. So we try to find departures from the predictions, departures that make sense, that surprise us and helps us investigating what's going on. So the priority should be to reality, and the model is your tool to interact with that reality in a way that generates new knowledge.
Yeah, that's a great answer. Thank you. I think this question relates a little bit to Josh's question earlier about what are patches. Shalatia says, does MBT apply on species which don't have a nest, so such as freely moving C. elegans, for example?
Oh, absolutely. The MBT applies to anything where there is an activity that generates benefits, preferentially, although you could generalize it, but preferentially with diminishing returns. And when there is a cost of transition, you have a choice of doing that. In fact, as you've seen in the laboratory, the test on the starlings and on the pigeons in the laboratory were not on breeding animals. They were on animals working to eat themselves. The central place foraging tests in the field just happen to be very convenient because you can train an animal to have a large sample size showing a semi-natural behavior going back and forth, and you can control the distance. Distance between patches is much more difficult to control, certainly if they are natural patches.
So we have a question from Emily, who says, how does the theory change in different dimensional space? So one-dimensional, two-dimensional, three-dimensional, or even sort of higher dimensional abstract space?
Well, you have to work it from first principle. It's not just picking up the model and try to extend it. Suppose that you have a situation where the animal is maximizing foraging rate, while, well, not maximizing, but is maximizing a compromise between foraging rate and reducing mortality and increasing the possibilities of courtship. Once again, you have several dimensions of behavior, and the animal probably faces a compromise that may give a predict. You have to remodel that situation from the beginning and take into account, for example, what's the cost of giving priority to one thing or another. There have been a number of experiments on that. In fact, very long ago, going before the experiments I talked about today in my thesis, I worked on optimal foraging and territorial defense on gratids. And so these animals were facing two patches with a certain cost of traveling between, and we were interrupting the animals and with the presence of a pseudo-territorial competitor to see how that affected them. And we found that they shortened the patch time when they could only monitor the presence of intruders by traveling between the patches. So the traveling had an advantage in another dimension, although had a cost in terms of food collection. And we found a compromise of that. That's, I forget the year, I think it was published in 81. In another case, we had starlings, which are very social animals, having an MVT type of situation, but where one of the patches allowed them to be near conspecifics and the other did not. And they stayed longer in that patch, and that way they lost some foraging profit because there was another dimension. So indeed, you have to think every multidimensional situation on its own, but yes, the framework is perfectly convenient for doing that.
Yeah, that's interesting because there's a little bit of a discussion around that question as well. I like Lawrence Hunt's comment, which is it's interesting to think about this in terms of optimizing different homeostatic needs rather than just, for example, one unitary reward. So yeah, this is a very interesting point.
Yeah.
We have another question from Joaquin, which I'm also quite interested in this, which is, could you expand on the last topic about foraging and the brain or neuroscience, please? So what would you say are the sort of pros and cons of uniting both topics? And obviously, I guess that's something that a fair number of people are quite interested in at the moment. So
I know, but I'm waiting for to listen to what you guys have to say. It's not for me to tell. I'll tell you personally, I started as a student working as a neurophysiologist, and I worked for about 4 or 5 years on that until I moved into a behavioral field, because I was having a sense of frustration that as a biologist with an evolutionary interest, the problems I was capable of studying then at brain level did not really connect with the behavioral problems I was interested in. And of course, there's been 50 years between then and now, so you can do much more now. For example, you can record brain activity of animals in more complex situations, in free-moving animals. We have computers to have computer games that offer complex problems. The only thing, I won't give an answer because I haven't got it, but I would say that what we should avoid is trivializing the foraging side of the task too much. Of course, if you are interested in the brain, you will have to simplify a little bit the foraging task. But think carefully about the foraging. Don't just take mechanically. Sometimes I read neuro-anatomically interested paper working on imaging or something, and I see the place where some foraging problem is solved, and I have to smile really, and it hasn't been thought through really, because these things are so complex, they fail so often that you can't actually think there is a brain bit that is doing the patch problem, and there's another brain bit that is doing the diet choice, for example. And even problems like how animals take decisions can be studied to a great level of sophistication at behavioral level before you start saying this is the bit of the brain where decisions are taken, right? So that it's not what I do, but I do think is at some point we have to value all the behavioral problems that we discussed, unless we really are natural theologians, like the optimal foragers were accused to be 300 years ago, well, 40 years ago. Unless we are we don't believe in the soul as controlling our behavior. We believe in the brain controlling our behavior. So at some point, any behavioral phenomenon is going to have a neurobiological counterpart. We are going to understand everything as a common system. All I'm asking is have some respect for the foraging research. I actually talked about work done in some cases 30-something years ago, in most cases over 30 years ago. There has been some time in between. When I read textbooks, for example, or some of the section on risk-sensitive behavior, and I read the description first published by people in 1979 as this is the problem of risk-sensitive behavior. And I said, my gosh, there's 150 papers published over 40 years showing that that wasn't the case, that the situation is much more complex, that there are memory effects, that the animals have to learn, and someone asked, that variance affects in different ways. We know how time intervals are computed. Animals don't know the interval precisely. They are subject to Weber's law, so they have variation. You're familiar with that. So, mind you, you can't just keep saying the first version of the model, be this the MVT or the diet choice model, whatever, without paying attention to the elaboration of these different situations.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I'm going to be cheeky and just add a question or comment of my own, I guess, which is that I think one reason why MBT sort of appeals to so many neuroscientists, for example, is that, in theory, it's a simple heuristic, right? It's comparison of two different parameters, and then that should be predictive of both, behavior and in theory, right? Like something in the brain. And I wonder this sort of idea of trying to find some representation of, for example, the average environment reward rate, or that something like that in the brain. Considering, I think, as you've written about before, I think even ecologists, understand that these sort of assumptions of optima don't actually, don't always apply, right? Just because something is predictive of an animal's behavior doesn't mean that's what the animal is sort of, thinking about. Anyway, so I don't know. I guess are you saying that it's okay to try and pursue this line of research if your foraging models are adequately complex? Or is it that in general we shouldn't be sort of trying to attempt to map MVT, for example, onto the brain at all?
I'm not placing myself in the seat of truth and judging, particularly judging things I don't know much about. I know about some things and not about others. What I'm saying is you could do bad work with any theoretical framework and in any field, and you could do good work in not any, but many. So if you ask me whether the kind of work that I advocate is characteristic of is representative of work going on foraging behavior, I couldn't answer that question. That was in, I think one of the slides I skipped at the end was Russell Gray correct in describing all the work published so far, doing a meta-analysis, as saying overall, most of the work is crap? Or was he wrong because some of the work was good? I can't answer that. I think there are many statistical properties of scientific production that are surprisingly disappointing. For example, when I first started to read about metrics, impact factors and that kind of thing, I remember hearing about the median score of scientific papers. I wonder if people around know what is the median number of citations of published scientific papers. And the median is 0, right? More than 50% of the work we do never gets cited. So it could just as well not have been done, right? So I don't know what's the statistical distribution with it foraging as opposed to with neural science, etc. That's for the philosophy of science. But you can do good work. You can do good work, and that's what you should aim at. That's whether it's in neuroscience or in behavioral ecology.
Thank you. Can I ask a question? All right. This is a bit related to an earlier point. So about doing foraging behavior justice, especially when you start combining it with neural studies, because I think one thing we have to do is like move to the lab for a lot of these things. And I was wondering, I mean, you have done both observations in the wild and experiments in the lab. And I mean, maybe you can elaborate a little bit on how doing both of this has helped you, because I think this is something that many of us struggle with designing a good experiment in the lab, because you're going to simplify, and we talked about this high dimensional space. How do you capture what's important? I think, how do you know that?
Yes, yes. I don't know if I sound escapist, but again, no recipes. You have to think properly when it's justified. For example, if you want to measure fitness consequences, there's no point in doing it. Fitness consequences of something, say of courtship or whatever. It doesn't make any sense to study this with an animal which has all the feeding needs satisfied and no predation, is just doing one thing. So you can measure the mechanisms that control behavior. You can measure whether there is a goal-directed, goal-seeking behavior in the animal. You cannot measure the fitness consequences unless you go to the field and look at the ecological circumstances in which the animals normally live and have lived in their past. So it depends what your question is. If you want to understand decision making, in my personal experience, sometimes in some systems you can, but in most cases you need to do a controlled experiment. For example, when can you do it? Some of the research we've done with starlings was looking at the allocation of food between feeding the young and the parent eating for self, right? And that complicates the problem of how long should you stay in the patch and everything else. It interacts with that. Who is the food for, right? Because if you're eating worms for yourself, and after all, parents have to eat as well, then they are not loading it in the bill. It doesn't slow them down, right? So the load function changes shape depending on what you are doing with the food. And you find all sorts of responsiveness of the animals to this kind of situation. That you have to do mostly in the field. You can take it to the lab with an animal that would breed, say a zebrafinch or something like that, and you can train it to work, and you can measure certain things in the laboratory about it. But you're not going to measure real fitness consequences unless you look at natural population. But if you want to understand whether the animal has some goal-seeking property, for example, you want to do a goal evaluation experiment in which you see whether the animal is working by habit or is responsive to whether that particular commodity is still worth working for or not. For example, an animal has worked for food and water, and you suddenly make it more thirsty or more hungry or less or whatever, and you see whether it varies what it does, then you have to do it in the lab, right? And you control everything. Some of the results that we get in the field, for example, the major discrepancy that we found that animals, when it was a linear function, they still took bigger loads from greater distances, which was the first big discrepancy I told you about today. One of the explanations was about travel time. I chose it because it's kind of didactic, it's clear. It's not the only thing, or it may not actually be the main thing. But the problem is that in field experiments, when the animals come to forage in your machine, you are competing with the real world. And the real world is out there. The animals may not go to your machine, go and forage somewhere else. And you have to start incorporating. So your setup has to be richer than the animal normally encounters in the world, or you wouldn't have any client coming to your machine. And so that by itself kind of constrains the kind of data you are collecting. So you've got to be aware of these things, and the lab is good for some things. The best of all worlds is to combine all things, but sometimes it's difficult to do, of course.
Alex, I was wondering, how are you for time? Because we do have more questions, but also only if you're,
Yes, I am fine. This is the end of the afternoon here in Oxford, so yeah.
I mean, it's great, and these are also really cool questions as well. So Armin says, wonderful talk, and thank you very much. So in many wild observations of foraging mammalians, we find repeating patterns of movement and revisiting the previous patches of food. Would you elaborate a bit on the use of memory function in foraging? So anything, any sort of specific highlight you'd like to mention? And also, can we, I guess this is a slightly separate question, can we think of a more unified theory by mixing modes of central foraging, which is more exploitative, and sort of long travel foraging, sort of more exploratory?
Okay, there were two things. The last one is the one, because, well, this could connect the two questions, because in my own mind, recency plays a role. And recency could be the explanation or the answer to the first of the two questions, and does memory play a role? So the memory analysis is crucial. If you have an animal, for example, which experiences an environment with variable travel times, to refer to the example we've been discussing this afternoon. Now, we know, because we programmed, that it's a stable environment with a certain distribution of travels and a certain variance. And that those properties, those parameters are static because we program them. But how does the animal know that those parameters are static? How does the animal know that if it has experienced 3 short ones, simply because it's a random sequence, it doesn't mean that the environment has changed, and now travel is going to be shorter in the future? Now, if the animal is judging the future by the past, which is not possible to do in any other way, then you would expect certain deviations will respond to how the animal integrates its memory. In fact, if you talk with an investor, with an economist, telling people which shares in blue chip companies or whatever have a certain level of risk, the way they do it, they look at the standard deviation of the price of shares in the last 5 years. And you say, well, how does that tell me what's going to happen in the next 5 years? Well, the answer is it doesn't, but they have to advise something. And so they just tell you that, which is a clear deviation from rationality, because we know that the past predicts the future only with very limited accuracy, particularly in the economy. Who would have predicted the pandemic effects? Well, actually, people did predict it, but still could not apply directly to things like the investment policy or whatever. So animals, when you think about their problem, it's not like the problem we abstract in our mathematical theorems. You have to think of it concretely, and then everything starts getting dirty. For example, responding to the last travel makes much more sense when you think of that than when you look at it in the theoretical model, because you knew that it's the same as the gambler's fallacy, right? Everybody knows if a gambler has a run of good luck, he thinks that the world is good for him that day or for her that day, and then it becomes more risk prone, which is of course stupid if you know how the gambler system works. But if you're an animal that doesn't know, you have the joint problem of tracking the environment, learning about average parameters in order to predict the future. And that requires studying memory. It's not possible without studying memory. So there's a continuous interaction. There should be a continuous dialectic between theorizing about consequences and studying how animals really do it, right? In some sense, sorry, this is too elementary, but in Nico Tinbergen's discrimination of the different kinds of explanation that you could have for behavior, that was already contained, that you have to study independently or in parallel the functional consequences and the mechanistic processes by which you do it. Should you study the brain as well? Yes, of course, if you can, but you should choose. There are horses for courses and there are models for problems, right? So sometimes some foraging problems are not suitable at our level of understanding today to study them at brain level, because we haven't got the richness of neural analysis that doesn't trivialize the foraging problem. Maybe I didn't answer some of the question, I don't remember.
No, I think you did.
Do you mind if I jump in with a question as well? I was just wondering if there were many empirical examples or predictions on how these optimal foraging strategies might adapt to changing environments across generations. So, you know, yeah, how might these strategies evolve?
Yeah, it's a problem because all our fitness analyses are transgenerational. You are absolutely hitting the problem where it is. Now, one way to look at it is that some mechanism can be very simple and can lead to near optimal behavior in almost any environment. For example, reinforcement learning. If you just, at a very general level, do more of what works, provided you have some criterion for deciding what you mean by works, right? What is good for you in some sense, then you could tune in the optimal behavior for some circumstance simply because you start producing variability in your behavior and eventually you do more of what works in these environments. The question is, that was one of the epicycles in Russell's marginal value theory, is what's the time scale at which you reinforce a certain amount of past behavior? And how do you attribute credit to things you've done in the past on the basis of desirable outcomes, right? In the marginal value theorem, it's not that difficult. The animal, suppose that the decision the animal takes is living. Everything else is no decision. You go to a patch, you start foraging, and you have to decide when to go, right? And if you say, well, whenever I go in this circumstance, after a while, this is the amount of food I get. And when I go in a different circumstance, this is the amount of food I get. So just by reinforcement learning, if you design the robot to do this, the robot would actually adjust to the current circumstances to do the right thing. Right? So it is possible for simple mechanisms such as reinforcement learning, associative learning of different natures, for example, being sensitive to the causal structure of the world. What precedent events tend to be good predictors of subsequent ones. If you really have been designed by natural selection to be responsive to real cause-effect relationships, then you are bound to finally find solutions provided the environment is sufficiently stable, right? If the environment changes all the time, then the nature of the optimality problem has changed, right? So it's not simple, but it can be done with simple mechanisms, and that's what works between generations. In many cases, the animal has no chance of learning by reinforcement learning. One typical example is if you think of a butterfly choosing the plant in which to lay eggs, the mother is never going to see the consequences of her behavior, right? It lays the eggs and then she dies. And then the new generation does well or poorly, depending on the plant in which the mother laid the eggs. If you do that, then certain preferences cannot be learned by the animal, have to be inherited, because that's the scale at which the payoff occurs. So natural selection has to shape behavior in that way. But when you have a vertebrate foraging for many cycles in a place, like a starling doing 300 trips a day, feeding the young, between 200 and 300 trips, then it has the opportunity to know when are the chicks getting better. And there's something else. There's a kind of metaphor I like to share with you. I've always used it as to what is the use of the models. For me, the model, the best analogy I can think of, is like equivalent to when you are in the twilight and you're seeing reality with poor discrimination, and you switch a torch. And when you switch the torch, the focus of what you're illuminating becomes sharp. But then everything else around it becomes darker than it was, and you don't see it as well as before. So the model has the dual effect of sharpening your thinking about what you are modeling and blurring your perception of things that you're leaving out that could be just as important, right? So there is no fixed recipe, but you have to use them sensibly.
Okay, maybe I just also jump in with the last question, maybe before we end. I just wanted to ask how optimality could kind of interact with predictability of the behavior in terms of like if you have competition with like not only other species but also the same species like animals in your cohort, and potentially also predators, for example, in terms of like how much of the variability could be maybe explained through not be acting according to optimality to be less predictable in that sense, and how much maybe could also be linked to things like personality or individuality.
Yeah. All important questions, all deserve a long talk, of course. I'm starting to get a little bit dispersed. Now, the problem of competition. Yes, I have been working today as if animals lived alone in the world. And that's a very major and almost absurd abstraction. Right? We had to do it, and we ensured that the conditions when we tested them were appropriate for the assumptions we were making. Optimality per se won't solve that, because optimality, the way I see it, maybe not everybody would agree, it's not a statement about the animals. Optimality is a technique. Is what optimality is. You make a certain assumptions, biological assumptions, you reason about the problem, and you use optimality techniques. For example, if you have described the functions mathematically, you could find the optimum by differentiation. And now when you do that, you're using optimality techniques to find what the optimum is. But optimality is not going to cure absurd hypotheses about what's going on in reality. If your functions don't relate to reality, then you could hammer it with a huge optimality sledgehammer, but you're going to get is something that doesn't fit the biology, right? So optimality is the smallest of our problem. It's actually it's a technique. It's like I repeated at the beginning, the marginal value theorem. If you manage to produce a theorem, then you don't need empirical test. A theorem is a theorem. A theorem is either mistaken, and that's trivial, or it's a proper theorem, and then the demonstration is true in the sphere in which you tested it. But you have to interact with the world to see if it has a progressive interaction with the complex real world, where things like competition with other members of the species participate. So certainly for foraging starlings, I'll tell you, for example, one anecdote from so many years ago, and it's still stuck in my memory. I was in one of those experiments. I was sitting in my tent, dropping worms through the pipe, and just looking what the starling. And the starling appeared to be working on this, but also was raising its head and looking around. And I thought, yeah, maybe it's looking for predators or vigilance or something like this. But at some point, uncharacteristically, the animal leaves the patch, and this is proper patch because it's defined by me as a setup, and leaves it when it shouldn't. Too early, suddenly between two worms being delivered, which is not what they normally do. What does it do? It flies like an arrow back to its nest, and I can see that there was another male playing up with the female of this starling, and this was about 200 meters away, 100, 200, I forget exactly. So the starling was foraging and vigilating its own nest to see whether things were correct at home, as it were. I was completely unaware of this aspect. And of course, in nature, the animal is coping with that. Someone asked before about multidimensional models. Here you have, is doing at certain times in the period, is doing mate guarding at the same time as it is foraging. And that influences its behavior. And you don't know what the animal is looking around.
Well, I think we should probably leave it there. Thank you so much, Alex, though. This has been great.
Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you.
I hope you enjoy the rest. I'm going to be listening the rest of the series, so it should be interesting in seeing my colleagues improving on this as they can.
No, it's been a great starting point, I think, for sure. Like, yeah, kicking off our series. So yeah, thank you, and thank you, of course, everyone who's attended as well. And I will end the podcast now. Thanks.
So one question before we go. This is being recorded, you said?
Yes.
And the link to the recorded one, presumably you will share it or whatever.
Yes, yeah, I'll send you an email with it once it's uploaded.
Okay.
Lovely.
Bye-bye, everybody. Stay safe.
Thank you.